Brauner with Virginia Cooperative Extension and the Master Gardener Program. And we're going to be talking about seed starting today a little bit about the Virginia Cooperative Extension Program up front. A little over 100 years ago, when the land-grant universities were set up by an act of Congress, one of the deals in that was that they would take the knowledge that they develop at those universities and promulgate that out to the public. So farmers and even small farmers all the way up to large farmers could benefit from the knowledge that's generated at the land-grant universities. And that continues to this day. Each of the land-grant universities in each of the states in the union has cooperative extension offices in each city and county so that they can spread that information out. And the Master Gardeners are a key part of that program. So we do all sorts of programs from seed starting to healthy Virginia lawns to pruning and a lot of those other things. Now, of course, this is during the pandemic, so things are a little bit different here, and we're not doing all of this stuff in person, but we are trying to reach out and have several different programs like this available to you at home through Zoom. So you'll see through the late winter and into the spring, we're going to be offering a whole bunch of different ones. And you can access those by going online to either the York County Public Library webpage and following their links to the different ones, or looking on Facebook for the York Poquoson Master Gardeners and doing it there. And I believe that Poquoson has also shared this on their website. So you can view this a whole bunch of different ways, but it is important, just like you did with this one, for you to register for each one so you get the link and you can do the rest of them. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll step right into this. Just make sure that, there we go. One of the big questions about starting from seed, and people view it as a difficult thing. And it's not really. There's a couple of things that you need to know how to do. And once you get those couple of tricks down, it's actually quite simple to do. But the big question is, why would I want to do this at home? Why not just go to a big box store or a local nursery and buy the seedlings off of the table or off of the shelf? And there's a couple of different reasons for that. Number one, you can just look from the waste perspective. There's a huge amount of waste when it comes to produce in America. 50% of all of the food that we create in America actually goes to waste, whether it rots on the vine and never comes out of the farmer's field, or it spoils en route to the store, or it gets to the store and it's not in saleable condition. Or maybe it comes home with you and you have every intent of using it, but then it gets in the back of the crisper drawer, and after you've forgotten it for a couple of weeks back there, it starts composting in the back of your drawer and turns into some sludge at the bottom. I know that doesn't happen to anyone else, but sometimes it happens to me. The amount of waste really is pretty large for each American that's out there. When you do things at home, you can manage that a little bit better. Store-bought produce that you don't grow at home, but you go to the store and you buy, it's good. But you have to realize when they're producing that in the store, the produce that they make for the store is optimized for certain things. They want to make sure that when it gets to the store, it looks good, it's going to be in saleable condition, and it's going to last a long time on the shelf. So those are the things that they select for. And when we select for certain things and not others, we're by definition not selecting for the things that sounds pretty simple, but that we're not choosing to select for. And that means that those tend to drop off. Think about roses. Everyone, especially coming up to Valentine's Day, wants a nice long stem red rose that's very compact and looks beautiful. But as we've selected for those over the year, one of the things that we're not selecting for is smell. So when you go and buy those beautiful long stem red roses for Valentine's Day, you're probably going to be buying roses that don't have any smell. It goes the same thing in the store. When we're selecting for long shelf life with looking good on the shelf, we're not selecting for taste or nutritional value. Now, I'm not saying that those things aren't there, but there might not be in the same quality of those two qualities as you would find otherwise if we were selecting for them. And then there's a carbon footprint of just getting them to the store in general. We spend a whole bunch of money each year on food. And you can see the numbers there on your screen. It's really amazing. But here's what I'd like you to think about a little bit. They did a survey about 10 years ago where they looked at the houses in the US and how many households actually had a home garden. They figured out that about 30% of the households in the United States had some sort of garden at home. And then they did a little bit more of a survey and they figured out that between the cost of seeds and the cost of soil and any fertilizers that they were putting down, each household spent about $70 on average on their garden in the backyard. Now, some of us spend a lot more, and some of us don't spend quite that much, but on average, $70. And then at the end of the season, they went back and they tabulated up how much produce those people took out of their garden. And it was about a $530 on average, the value of the produce that they took out of their garden and they had on their table. Now, you think about our growing season around here in Virginia. Our growing season really starts about the last frost of the season, which usually happens around tax day in mid-April. And then it goes all the way into November when we have our first frost and it kills off the most of the vegetables that we have in our garden. So that's about what, 7 months? So in 7 months, all of these people on average that are gardening took $70 and turned it into $530. I don't know about you, but I don't know a single other investment vehicle on Wall Street where I can get a 700% return on investment. But that's what they're doing when they garden. And when we garden at home, we can get a similar investment. And not only is it a good monetary investment, but we're eating more nutritious food and we're eating food that actually tastes better. It tastes better when you grow it at home and you can pick what you want to have growing in your garden. And when you do that, you can have all sorts of different variety about what you have, what you're growing. So then the question is still, why don't I just go to the big box store and buy what they have there? Because they carry tomatoes too, and they do. But they only carry what, maybe 4, 5, 6 different types. If they're a boutique or a nursery, they might have up to 12 different kinds of tomatoes that they sell, but they probably don't have more than that. Whereas if you go to any of the seed sellers online, like Renee Seeds or Heart Seeds or Burpee or TomatoGrowers.com, and look at the number of varieties of different tomatoes they have dozens. They have some of them upwards of 100 different types of varietals of tomato seeds alone that you can choose between. You can choose big tomatoes for beefsteak tomatoes for your hamburger. You can have cherry tomatoes, small little grape tomatoes for your salad. You can have very juicy tomatoes that just pop and full of juice, or you can have meaty tomatoes that are better for paste. And you can choose whether you want it sweet or a little bit tartar. All sorts of different varieties that you get to choose. It puts you more in the driver's seat. But you can't buy those if you're just going to the store to do it. You have to grow it from seed. And it's not just tomatoes, it's cucumbers, it's beans, it's peas. There's a whole variety that opens up when you're willing to buy from seed. Now you can go online and do that, and that's the way that a lot of people are doing it these days. I'm sure that most of you guys follow the news and realize that in the last year, most seed companies saw a 6-fold increase in the amount of seed orders that they took. Now, it's not that we're having, and most of the seed companies ran out of the seeds that they had. Why? It's not that we're running out of seeds in America, but it's that they lack the manpower to actually take those seeds, put them in the envelopes, and send them out to people. So getting the seeds these days is a lot of people have shifted their calendar for buying seeds to much earlier in the year to make sure they're not in the same boat and lose out on that again this year. And they're expecting a similar interest in home gardening this year. The other neat thing is that you can get disease resistance. If I took a tomato plant that I'm interested in and I looked at the name of the tomato on these seeds, and I saw a bunch of letters after the tomato, maybe T or M or V or F, F1, F2. Those are different disease resistances that are common to that species or that subspecies of tomato. In other words, it has been bred for disease resistance. When I started off gardening here, I'm not originally from Yorktown. I was in the Air Force and moved all over the country and over the world, and I've gardened in a lot of different places. But when I came here and I started growing tomatoes, I ran into a problem. They were doing really well, and all of a sudden they wilted and they died and didn't look very good. So I turned to my extension office and went to the extension agent and asked him, hey, can you help me out? So we took that tomato plant, we sent it off to Virginia Tech to get tested, and the test came back for fusarium wilt. And it turns out that fusarium wilt in this area is pretty common. So what does that mean? That means that the next year when it came time to buy seeds for my tomatoes, I looked for tomato seeds that were specifically resistant to fusarium wilt. And I didn't have those problems anymore. And now I pretty much pick those disease-resistant tomatoes that I'm not going to have those problems with, and it's solved. I don't have that same luxury if I'm just trying to go to a big box store or even a nursery and looking for the varieties, but I have a lot more choices when it comes to starting things from seed. And the other thing is, you can get a lot of seeds for free. I grow mini bell peppers here. I love them. They're little, they're packed with flavor, and they're just incredibly prolific. They produce all day long. And the nice thing is those are open pollinated. So that means that I can collect the seeds, dry them out, and then you plant these seeds next year. And that costs me nothing to do that. So it's really kind of an economical way of going through it. And it's not just the peppers I can do that with. I can do that with blackberry lilies or roast swamp mallow or ornamental peppers or butterfly weed. There's all sorts of different ways you can do that. I teach classes on that too, and I'm happy to teach those later in the year, in the summer and going into the fall, because I do a lot of seed gathering, and then I have those seeds available for me and for my friends next year when it comes to growing plants. And some of those are in the packets that you have and that some of you picked up. One of the big things when it comes to starting from seed is understanding the climate around you, because some seeds are relatively fast growing. Some seeds are not quite as fast growing and need a little bit longer to get started. Some seeds need different germinating conditions to start growing. And so if I'm planning all of this out, it really helps to know a little bit more about my climate. And in Virginia, in the Hampton Roads area, most of our area is in zone 8A. They've divided up the country into what's called winter hardiness zones. What does that mean? It takes a look at the average hottest temperature in the area, the average lowest temperature in the area, when the first frost is for the season, when the last frost is for the season, and it groups them together because we love grouping things together and generalizing, and it gives you a general picture for your area. Now, it doesn't mean that every year is going to be like that, but the preponderance of most years are going to fit into the scheme. And around here in zone 8A, our last frost date for the year is usually the beginning to the middle of April. By tax day, we're usually done with frost. And we likely will have our first frost of the season in November by about the middle of November. So if I know that, I can start my planting based on those dates. And we have a great publication that I'm going to be sharing with you later that is available for free for you to download off the web. And you can have all of this information available to you at home, so you can do that planning yourself at home. That will tell you that you don't want to be starting your peppers, or you don't want to be starting your tomatoes now, but now might be a good time to be starting your eggplants and your peppers, maybe your dill. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Interestingly, we are pretty close to the winter hardiness zone of 7B. So that means some of us might be right on the edge, and that you have to take that with into consideration when it comes time to starting your seeds, because depending on how hot or cold the winter is, might affect how those generalities are in play this year. So in that information, they'll give you a chart, and in this handout, and I'm going to give you a link to it at the end of this presentation. And some of you who picked up kits actually have this handout in your kits that you picked up. If you look back on page 6, you will see that for the starting chart for zone 8A, And you will see it laid out for by which date you want to be starting which plants and when is the appropriate time to do that. And this really helps me plan out my calendar, because actually in January, I'm already planning out which varietals I want to plant in the garden, when I want to be starting them, and how I want to do that. And it helps me stay on schedule, so my plants that are ready to go in the garden are ready at the right time. And I don't have tomatoes that become long and leggy and aren't going to survive so well because I started them at the start of February, when I really should have waited into March to start those tomatoes. The other way that you can tell that is, if you don't have access to this or you've forgotten what the link is, pull out that seed packet in front of you. On that seed packet, it'll tell you how long before you want to be starting these seeds, when you want to start them germinating, how many days it will take you to germinate. And in some of the seed packets that we send out in the packets, for those of you who got the kits, you'll see that those are also labeled on the labels on those small manila envelopes that you have in your seed kits. So there's a couple things that you need, nothing cosmic, but these are the things that we're going to talk about, exactly what you're going to want in your to be successful when your seed's starting. You need your growing medium. You need some containers to keep them in. You need the right amount of light and the right amount of warmth, and it's not the same for everything. You need the right amount of water, and then you need to know how to harden things off. So let's step into each one of those and I'll talk about it. So not everything that I'm going to be focusing on non-hydroponics here, but there is an entire realm of hydroponics, and it's easy to do that. Or it's easy to set that up, and some people really enjoy that. I don't do hydroponics. I use a soil-based medium for growing my plants, but that's very, you can get a lot of information, including on the Virginia Tech website, about starting up with hydroponics. But I'm going to stay with more of a soil-based planting medium here. And when you're going out to the stores, and if you want to buy something off the shelf, you're going to see the bags of potting soil, or the bags of soil, are labeled a couple of different ways, and it can get really confusing, and there's a lot of marketing involved. So here's what you need to focus on. Does it say potting soil? Does it say seed starting soil? Or does it say garden soil or vegetable gardening soil? What's the difference there? Potting soil or seed starting soil is usually a lot smaller fibers in it. It's a lot smaller material in it, with smaller bits, and it's got a different composition, whereas garden soil tends to be a lot heavier and larger pieces. And usually in potting soil, there are a couple of different things. One thing is peat moss. Peat moss is this light material. It's incredibly light when it's dry. It's almost dust-like, and it is great at absorbing water and holding on to that water and slowly releasing it. Then another thing that they have is usually these white little flakes. They're either called perlite or vermiculite. Vermiculite and perlite are very close, but they're small little tiny rocks. And these are great at not only holding on to the water and then releasing it to the plants, but they're good at maintaining space in the soil. So those roots that are growing in the soil can actually grow and have space to expand into. Roots actually need air, just like they need nutrients, and they need water as well. And so the vermiculite and perlite help with that. And then there's organic material like compost that's mixed in there. Now, if you want to mix up your own potting soil, you can mix up your own by getting some compost, some peat moss, and some vermiculite, and mixing that together. Heavier a little bit on the peat moss and the vermiculite than on the compost, but getting a good mix of each, about evenly between the three of those. But slightly less compost for your potting or seed starting medium. But you can just buy those off the shelf too in bags at any garden center or big box store, and get those. Just make sure you're getting that potting soil or the seed starting soil. And then the next thing that you need to consider is, what are you going to put that in? Now, and it kind of gets down to that paper versus plastic. Now, there's all sorts of plastic containers that you can get like this that are going to work fine, and you can do seed starting in these or even smaller ones. They make them in a biodegradable cardboard-like material, like these pots here. These are fine also, although they will dry out a lot faster than the plastic pots will. But I prefer a different solution. I prefer using newspaper pots. And that's why some of you who got the kits have that in your kits to get started with. Now, what I do is I take a bit of newspaper like this. And if you have a page of newspaper, you can cut it into 6 slices across the newspaper. And you don't need to have it all this far across. That central crease in the middle, you can just rip that down. And about 4 inches or so, 3.5 to 4 inches wide, and about, I don't know, what is this, 10 inches long. And then all you have to do is you have to make it into a pot. Now, they make these pot makers that they sell on major online retailers that sound like a river in the Amazon. Oh, did I say that? Not supposed to mention individual retailers, but they sell them there. They sell them on other gardening websites, and they actually will sell them in some specialty nurseries that have better supplies. But all you have to do is take that newspaper, you wrap it around the pot maker like that. So I'm going to take my newspaper pot maker. I'm going to wrap this around like so, where I have a fair amount of material off the bottom of that newspaper pot maker like that. And I'm going to make sure that it's not super loose around it. And then I'm going to take that material at the bottom and crimp it in. And to make sure I crimp it in a little bit better, there's a base. I press it against it like that. And voila, I have a small newspaper pot. And then all I have to do with that newspaper pot is take some of my potting soil, which I have very conveniently right here at my, right here. And I am going to fill that up with the potting soil that I have. Not compact it down very deeply. And there I go, my own little pot right here with plenty of medium in it. Now, let's say that you say, Nate, I get it, but I haven't spent the $20 on one of these. I'm not sure I'm going to be into this. So is there a way I can do this without spending the $20 on this? I will tell you that this is one of the best $20 I've ever spent, but you might not be ready to make that kind of commitment. So, hey, that's fine. You probably, most of us have spice jars around, not the small little ones, but the little bit larger ones like this. And it works. You can do a very close approximation with this as well. All you have to do is wrap it around it like so. Then you push in the bottom like this. And the thing that you don't have with this is you don't have a way to really grind it so you crimp the paper. So you just have to go around here with your fingers and do that with your fingers instead. Once you've done that, you then have a newspaper pot just like this that you can go ahead and fill up in the same manner, and it'll work for you that way as well. Like I said, I like having the right tools, and this little pot maker has really served me well. It lasts a long time, but it works either way. So I like doing that. Why do I like using the newspaper pots? Because the newspaper pots are biodegradable. I can plant that whole thing into the garden. Whereas if I'm using either of these, especially this one, I have to take the plant out of this and put it into the garden, which causes a little bit of root stress. Was there a question?
Yes. So there was somebody who said, is there anything we should watch out for when using newspapers, toxins in the ink?
No, most of the newspapers now are printed using soy-based inks, and so they're fine with that. You don't want to use the waxy type of paper that you want to stay away from because that is not as biodegradable. But any of the standard newsprint that you would have in the main section of the newspaper is absolutely fine. The other nice thing that I was talking about with this, were there other questions?
There's one other, somebody pointed out that they have one of these, but they found that they mold too easily sometimes. They get kind of moldy.
Yes, so that would be so getting too much mold in there is indicative of keeping it too wet. And we'll talk about the proper amount of moisture later. But yes, that is a potential problem that you could have with this. And we'll talk about that because that is really important. The nice thing I like about this is I can put the whole thing into the ground and I'm not disturbing the roots when I do that. And the roots are the most fragile part of the plant. The less I damage the roots, the better that plant is going to grow for me. Let me, yes, one more.
Toilet paper rolls.
Yes, you can do toilet paper rolls as well. You take the toilet paper roll and you crimp it in and you make up a similar size one. The reason why I don't like toilet paper rolls is the same reason why I don't go for these as much. They're thicker. The roots can't penetrate this as well, although they can over time, especially when this gets really damp. But they don't break down as easily as the newspaper pots. The downside of the newspaper pots is that they're not as sturdy as this. So if I was going to have them out and try and grow them not in a plastic container like what I'm going to be talking to you about, they won't hold up as well, whereas this will. But that's why I use the technique that I use in making my little greenhouses. And we'll get to that a little bit more as we go along with this. Any other questions?
Somebody was asking about a substitute for peat moss.
Cocoa peat fiber. Peat moss is not a sustainable resource. And so if you are looking for something that is more sustainable and earth friendly, cocoa fiber is sustainable and earth friendly and serves the same purpose. So you can look for that, and that is readily available. Let me start share my screen again, and so we can go back to the presentation because I have a bunch of things I want to show you there. The other thing with seeds is some seeds need special conditions in order to germinate. Now remember, that seed is a living part of the plant, right? It's just dormant. And it's going to stay dormant until it gets the right amount of conditions to get started. And for a lot of seeds, that's just getting wet. Once it gets wet, it'll wake up and it'll start growing. It'll use that moisture to take the genetic material inside and start using that energy that's stored inside the seed to grow a little plant coming up, throw out its two false leaves, which are called cotyledons, and go start photosynthesizing and go from there. Not all seeds start exactly that way. Some of them need special treatment. Some of them are optimized for being a plant that grows in cold climates. So they need a cold period called stratification before they start growing. So those are the kind, like native plants, that need a cold period of wet and cold before they'll start germinating. That is a little bit of a discussion for a different time, and I'm happy to share with you some great techniques on that, and I can share those afterwards in the question period if any of you are interested in that. But others need a little bit of soaking. That seed might have a little bit of a thicker coat, and it takes longer time to get into that. Legumes like peas and beans are a classic example of that. So for legumes, I take hot tap water. When I say hot tap water, not boiling, but about 110, 120 degrees. I put it into a small bowl, and then I'll put my peas, my legumes, my beans into that and let them soak for about an hour or two. That will let that outer shell start to break down before I go ahead and I plant those in the garden. And just so we're no confusion here, legumes get directly sowed into the garden. They don't get started this way. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. There's also some scarification where that rough surface needs to be broken up a little bit. Lots of times that can be helped along by soaking them, and it can also be helped by, for some certain seeds, a little bit of sandpaper on them and rubbing them on the sandpaper. But most of the ones that I've put out in the packets that you have will not need that kind of treatment. Let's see. Let's see if I can get this going here. All right. So light and warmth. This is a big thing. This is probably one of the biggest areas that people have trouble with when they are getting their garden going. because they think, hey, seed starting, I've got a great, beautiful bay window, south facing, gets lots of sun during the day. I'm going to start my seeds in that window. And if you think about it, we are, even this time of year, we probably get about 10 hours of sun. And the sun is very low in the sky, so it goes through more of the atmosphere before it gets to us. And by the time it gets here, it goes through your windows in your house. And your windows don't let all of that light through. They cut down on it. And in fact, that's one of the things that they advertise about windows is it cuts down on transmissivity as it's coming through the window, so it doesn't let all of that heat come into your house and get it too warm during the summer. The downside of that is that light, once it comes through your windows, is not necessarily strong enough to help your seeds get started. So just putting them in a south-facing window is not going to be good enough for seed start. You need a good 14 to 16 hours of sunlight for your seeds to get going, and it needs to be bright. So in order to do that, what you need to do is you need to have some bright lights. And you can see in these pictures that I have there how they've rigged up some shop lights to be over the area. Shop lights are about the easiest thing to do. They used to have fluorescent bulbs, but now you get them with LED bulbs. And you get something like 4,000 lumens out of a shop light. And it's very inexpensive to run. The heat coming out of it is low, so you don't need to worry about that. And you can set it on a timer and make sure you get that 14 to 16 hours of sunlight out of that. And that will really help with your seed germination. Are there any questions? Okay. So that is really critical. The other side of it is warmth. And it really depends on the seeds that you're starting, how much warmth you need. I wanted to show you here, this is the potting cart that I built a couple of years ago. I have modified it now, and I'm actually standing behind it. So when you look at the screen with me, and I'm going to stop sharing in a little bit so you'll see it, you'll be able to see how I'm using it today. But it's a potting cart that gives me lots of room on it. I got a little bit in trouble at home because I started taking over every horizontal surface in the house with setting out my seedlings and setting up lights. And I got told that I wasn't the only person living in the house, and maybe I needed to come up with a different solution. So I came up with my own seed starting cart. And this allows me to lower or raise the light that's over the plants. It allows me to have heat mats out on it, and it gives me a dedicated growing space. Now, why would I want to raise or lower that light? Well, quite simply, even though these lights are really bright, like 4,000 lumens, they're not putting out anywhere as close to amount of the intensity as the sun would be in the summer when they're normally used to growing. And so if I put it very high above the plants, say my tomatoes or my peppers, they're going to grow up to try and get to that light. And they're going to turn into tall, spindly plants that are not very strong. But if I put it right over the plants, so it's no more than about an inch or two above the plants, they're going to get a little stockier, they're going to be stronger plants, and they're going to transplant a lot better into the garden. And that's what I'm showing here in this photo. How I adjust it so my light is right over the plants, and they're all getting the right amount of light. So when we talk about heating plants and heating seeds, you have to understand how these seeds are used to germinating. A tropical plant like a pepper or a tomato is used to really warm conditions when it starts germinating. So it wants to be really nice and warm. It wants to be toasty. Right around 80 degrees is perfect for it. It'll germinate in less time, and you'll get a higher percentage of germination. Whereas if you're talking about spinach, which is more of a cool season type crop, if you get up into the 80s with that and try and germinate it there, it's not going to do really well. The best germination rates for that are probably going to be if you put it in a garage that doesn't freeze. That's about 50 degrees, and it's going to germinate in less days, and it's going to germinate in less time, and you'll have a higher germination rate. And so what we have here on your screen are some charts that help you know what the difference there is. you get a percentage of germination there on the left-hand side of your screen, and it tells you you want to obviously optimize that. So if you were to look at beans, you'd see that below 59 degrees, you have a very low percentage chance of them germinating at all. Once you get up to about above 60 degrees, it becomes a lot better. Probably about 60 to 80 degrees is optimal. And then if you look at the chart way over on the right, you'll see that the number of days that it takes to germinate at 77 degrees is 8, as opposed to 16 at 59 degrees. So you can use this to plan how you're doing that. That means when I start my spinach seeds and I'm growing them, I know from looking at these charts that the optimal germination percentage rate for spinach is right around 50, in the 50-degree range. And if I look over at the number of days it takes me to germinate, I know that depending on where I am in there, it's between a week to a dozen days for it to germinate. So I know that 50 degrees is about the sweet spot for that. Whereas with tomatoes, I need it to be quite a bit warmer. So how does that work for me? Well, I know that if I germinate my spinach, and this just takes until it starts growing up, but if I germinate that unheated for my spinach, that's going to work out the best for me. Maybe I could even do that in the garage, in a garage that doesn't freeze. Because around here, my garage stays at about 50 degrees, 55 degrees. So that might be an ideal place for it until it starts growing. Whereas my tomatoes, I've got to provide some bottom heat. Most of us keep our homes somewhere between, depending on who we are, somewhere between 66 to about 74 degrees. And even that is not really going to be warm enough because the soil that is going to be a little bit cooler than that you have in these pots. So I get these mats that I put underneath my seed starting trays, and those will raise the temperature of the soil in these trays to about 10 degrees above the ambient temperature. So in my house, that means that I'm raising it to between 78 to 80 degrees that are inside of this. And that is perfect for my peppers and my eggplants and my tomatoes, and they're going to grow a lot better that way. Whereas my spinach, if I put that on it, it wouldn't germinate quite as well. So I need to know about that, and that's where these charts come into handy. Where can you find these charts? Well, I'm going to give you some links to some publications at the end of this that are really quite helpful. There are other good books. I highly recommend Square Foot Gardening by Mel Bartholomew. That's where some of the rest of these charts come from. Works out quite well. So then the big question, and this is probably the area that most people get wrong, is how wet do I do it? Do I want it to dry out in between watering them when they're seedlings, or do I want it to be wet? But how do I keep it from getting moldy, like that question that we got earlier? And the answer is you want the small newspaper pots to be moist, but you don't want it waterlogged. So if you are doing it, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a second so you can see me instead. If I have my tray like this, I want this to not have standing water at the bottom of it. So when I look at this, there's no water at the bottom, but this is nice and good and heavy, and that's something that you figure out over time. But you can pick up a plant or you can pick up a tray like this, and you can tell whether it's light, meaning that it doesn't have a whole lot of water, or whether it's heavier because it has enough water. And I am a huge fan of the weigh test. I'm not a huge fan of taking my finger and poking it in the soil. Why? Because there are roots growing in that soil, and those root hairs are very easily damaged. So when I poke my finger in the soil, I'm disturbing all of that. But if I can just get by with a weigh test and gauge it that way, well, that's a lot better. So I'm a huge fan of that. You want it moist, but you don't want waterlogged. Once those plants start growing, you don't want to be wetting the leaves on those plants because that will encourage disease. So how do I do it? Take a little spray bottle and I spray at the base of the plants. And that helps me out. I can also take a long neck watering can like this and get down into the bottom and and pour a little water that way. But I don't want to be unnecessarily getting the leaves of the plants wet, because that will encourage disease. That'll encourage that mold that someone asked about earlier, and we don't want to have that going on. Go back to sharing here.
Amanda asks, should you put water in the bottom to soak up or water each plant individually?
Well, I like at the beginning not putting water in the bottom, because then you can tend to overwater that way. But once my plants start growing up, sometimes the bottom watering is the best way to do it. You just have to make sure that you're not putting too much water in there. So it's going to take time for it to absorb and soak up that water that you put in there. So you can start by watering down at the bottom, and that's a beauty of newspaper pots, is it makes it very easy for that to be absorbed that way. What you want to make sure is when you come back 5 minutes later and it's had time to absorb, that you don't see water at the bottom of your little mini greenhouse here. You want it all to have been absorbed up.
So somebody said, do you avoid moisture probes also to lessen root damage?
Yes, I do. I don't use moisture probes because, again, I'm disturbing the soil. And once you learn this super simple weight test, and it doesn't take much time at all of us can tell whether something's a little heavier or a little bit lighter. And once you develop that feel, you don't need any of that stuff. So why do that if you don't need it? The other thing to realize is that water for plants is like is as good of a tool for the gardener as chocolate is for a husband who's made a mistake. Chocolate tends to solve a lot of problems. So does water for plants. So anytime you transplant the plant, anytime that plant has gone through stress, a nice watering for that plant will really help make it a whole lot happier. So water is a great tool. Just don't overdo it, especially when it's in a thing that won't drain quite as well as others. When it comes time to transitioning into the garden, this is another area where we can make mistakes, because my plants in the middle of April are going to have been growing in here and are going to hopefully look really nice after growing in here. They're going to have grown up. They'll be all green. But just like all of us, they're not ready for the summertime. If I go in, I've been outside several times during the winter every day, and I hang out outside as much as I can. But when it comes time to going to the beach for the first time, if I go to the beach and I don't put on any sunscreen, I'm going to be really hurting from that, right? My skin is just not used to the rays of the sun. Similarly, the leaves of the plants are not used to the intensity of the sun's light when I go to put them out. So I need to harden them off a little bit. What is hardening off? It's getting them adjusted to being outside as opposed to in here. So the way that works, and it goes on over about 10 days to 2 weeks, is on a nice day when it's not freezing outside, I will take, when I'm getting ready to harden them off, so say the start of April, I will take these trays and I will take them outside to an area that gets morning sun. It's not too windy, it's not too harsh outside, and I will give them about 2 hours of morning sun, and then I'm going to bring them back inside and put them in my house. And then the next day, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to give them about 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours of that nice morning sun. And I'm going to slowly get them used to being outside a little bit more, in a little bit more of the elements. And as I gradually condition them to that, they can grow fortify their leaves so they can handle that a lot better. But if I just shock them and take them outside and put them straight outside, they're not going to handle that very well. So now I would like to stop sharing my screen for just a moment here. And I'd like to talk to you about how to go about taking care of your seeds. Now, those of you who got seed starting kits from us, I've got a number of things in them. You've got a plastic tray like this, a plastic shoebox. If you didn't get one of these, hey, don't feel too bad. You can go to any dollar store or Big Lots or Dollar Tree or any of those places and pick these up for $1. So they're not a whole lot. And then you've got a bunch of newspaper strips, and I've already shown you how to use those. Why do I use something like this? Well, I use this because I can make, in one of these, I can make 18 newspaper pots that I can plant plants in this and grow young seedlings in it. And it makes it into a really easy way for me to create a mini greenhouse for my plants. So I can fill this out really easily like this. I can make several of this. When it gets into the rest of the, or a month down the road, this entire potting cart, both or seed starting cart, both the top and the bottom, are going to be covered with seedlings. I'm going to have 200 here, and that's not unusual for me for a year for starting off the seedlings. And each one of these is going to have 18 in it, 3 rows of 6, or alternatively 6 rows of 3, whichever way you like to do it. But I'm going to fill it up here. I'm going to fill each one of this up with 18 of those, fill it up with a potting soil. And then, if you can notice here, on each one of my trays, I label it. And you can see right here how I label it. Each row has a label on it that shows it what I have planted in that row. Why? Because if anyone is anything like me, I'll have all these good intentions of course I'm going to remember what I planted there. And I go on to the next one, and I look back at that first one, and I'll have forgotten. So to help myself out, before I put the first seed in here, I put the labels on. And you can make that really easy, however you want to do it. I print them out because I'm a little obsessive compulsive on making that part neat, but you can just handwrite and put it on there, and then you'll remember what's there. And then I put the seeds in. And when I put the seeds in, how do I do that? Well, this potting soil is probably fairly dry. And so seeds, when they get planted in these, don't need to be planted very deeply. I remember when I started planting seeds, I thought I stick my finger in the ground up to my second or third knuckle and make a nice deep hole because it needs to be deep in there, plant the seed, and I'm good to go. And that's not necessarily what I want to do. Most seeds, as a rule of thumb, if you look at the seed packet, it'll tell you, most seed packets right on the back, how deep you need to plant that seed. And seed packets are a wealth of information. Some of them are better than others. This one happens to be one of my favorites, and it's the source of a lot of our donated seeds. This one's from Renee's Garden, and on the back, it gives you a wealth of information about these seeds. But if you take a look at the seeds, and these are some of my mini bell pepper seeds here, these seeds are really, really quite small, and they're by no means the smallest seeds that we have. But they're incredibly small, and they're very thin. When it comes time to planting my seed,
More like this.
can you see that?
There you go. Yep.
So when it comes time to planting this seed, I, as a rule of thumb, need to plant this 3 times the width of the seed deep. And when I say the width, I'm not talking side to side, I'm talking about how high this side is. So you can see that this seed, this pepper seed, is going to get planted maybe 1/8 of an inch down, maybe 3/16 of an inch down, but not very far down. Some seeds get surface germinated, and you'll see that on the labels. And then once I plant that in there, so how do I do that? I can either do that with my finger, or I can take my trusty chopstick, and I can make a little hole. I put the seed in there. Once I put the seed in, I'm going to take my watering bottle, and I'm going to give it about 10 spritzes in here. Now, why would I start off with this? I start off with these bottles, and again, a buck at pretty much any discount store or big box store, and you can pick up one of these. When I have this seed starting medium in here, the soil, it is dry and it's just waiting to expand, kind of like a sponge. And we all know that if you take a dry sponge and you try and mop up liquid on the counter, it's not going to work really well. But if you get that sponge wet first and you wring it out and you get that water in there, then it's going to absorb water a lot better. This medium in here is the same way. If you get it wet, a little bit of water to start with, it's going to open up, it's going to be ready to absorb water a lot better. And that way, after I've done that with each little cell, I can go back with my watering pail and I can go back and water all of them, give them a little bit more water until it feels a little bit heavier. And that's an easy way to do it. So it's really not cosmic at all. Remember, you can read the packet label, which I encourage you to do. if you have it. It'll tell you how deep to sow it, or you can just go ahead and use my rule of thumb, 3 times the width of the seed, planting it in there, and it'll work out just fine. Yes,
How many do you put in each pot?
that's a great question. 1 seed per pot. Now, I know a lot of people, you'll see a lot of places that say, oh, put 2 seeds in there and then call 1 out. You don't need to. Look at the germination rate off of those tables I showed you earlier. You can go back and look at it. Look at the germination rate for most of these seeds. They're pretty close to 90%. That means that I plant all of this out and I only put 1 seed in each one of these pots here. If I go back in a week and everything has come up but 1 of them, I can easily replant that seed and get it to start growing. I don't need to put 2 seeds in every pot because I'm going to have 2 plants coming up. But say you do that. Say they're really small seeds and you accidentally put in 2 seeds in there and both of them germinate and both of them come up, and then you're like, well, what do I do here? Hey, I've got 2 plants. That's good, right? And that is good, except that both of them are trying to use the same resources. And so that means that both of them are not going to do as well as just one in there that has access to all of those resources. And you need to pick the stronger one. And this is not Sophie's choice. You shouldn't feel bad. You shouldn't have remorse. You just need to figure out which one of them is stronger. What you don't want to do is reach out and pluck that one out. Why? Because it's been sending out all these root hairs and these tendrils all throughout there, and they're intertwined with the other one. So if you just rip that out of the soil, you're probably going to be damaging the root structure for the plant that you want to stay in there. So just take a small pair of scissors and clip that off right close to the base, and that will die off, and then the one that you want to live will grow up and it will turn into a really nice and healthy plant. Don't be afraid to cull things out. In fact, make that hard choice because your plant will do much, much better for it, and you'll be a lot happier. I'm going to go back to my presentation here because I think I have a little bit more information, and then we'll go to answering questions. Kind of close to the end. So we talked about all of this stuff on there, and I should have answered all of those questions. So remember at the beginning when I said, hey, there's a whole bunch of pubs that I'm going to offer you virtually. Even the ones of you who didn't get these, the seed starting kits from me, not from me, but from the extension, you have access to all of these publications as well. There's a QR code next to each one of the pages there for that publication. All you have to do is take your smartphone. You can scan that right now off of the screen on your computer, and it will pull up those publications for you off of the Virginia Tech website. You've also got the website on your screen there, pubs.ext.vt.edu, and you've got the pub numbers of them there. So you just write that down and you're going to be set. And in fact, those of you who got a kit from us got a printout of the screen, so you have that in your kit right now. Or you can take a screen capture of this and you'll be able to save it. I can't tell you how helpful it is to be able to have this pubs.ext.vt.edu website, because this is where you can go to get evidence-based information on planting. If you go and do a search on the web, you will get tons of websites that tell you the best way to plant something or to do your gardening. And some of them will be correct. But like a lot of things these days, judging the sources of your information can tell you how credible that information is. And if you find something with the .edu after it, it has probably been peer reviewed and has gone through enough review that it is evidence-based and there's actually science behind it. And that's what you're going to get when you go to the pubs.ext.vt.edu website. You're going to get a lot of that. Now, if any of you are joining us from out of state, your local extension office will have a similar website to this. But there's nothing to stop you if you live in Ohio or California from going to the Virginia Tech website. Just like there's nothing to stop any people who live in Virginia from going to the North Carolina website or the extension website in California or any of the other states. And there's a lot of good information out there that you can access that way.
All right, we have a couple of questions.
Yes, please go ahead.
One person is asking, how tall is your light stand, and are they 4-foot LED lights?
Yes. So I Yeah, God, I'm gonna stop sharing this right here, although I'll pull it back up later if someone wants to copy those QR codes. Let's see. So my stand here that I built, it goes up to just under 6 feet tall. And I have 2 shop lights that I have suspended over it. When I initially built it, I had one on here and it wasn't giving me enough light that I wanted. So these are 4-foot sections of shop lights. You can pick them up when they're on sale at the big box store that I go to, that I tend to buy these from. They're about 20 bucks. When they're not on sale, they're about 30 bucks. And they last forever. They don't put out any heat. So what I did was I hooked this up, and then what I did was I took a one of those timers that you get for your Christmas lights or your Hanukkah lights or whatever, holiday lights that you have. And I took a timer for that can take a lot of different plugs. And I plug in my heating mats and my lights into that. And so it automatically turns them on. I know it gets 14 hours of sunlight and heat a day. And then it rests at night and then it can start growing again the next day. But it makes it so I don't have to put as much thought into it every day. Because I get enthusiastic about this and really hopeful at the beginning of it. But then as it goes along, it'd be a real drag if I was having to remember to turn this on every day and turn it off every day. So having a timer on it really, really helps me out. What other questions are on
there? When seed starting, should you also continue to do companion planting?
Okay, so that is fantastic. Companion planting is super important. We do have pubs on the Virginia Tech website that talk about that. I do a lot of companion planting in my garden. I plant nasturtiums and dill with my cucumbers and my cucurbits like squash, because those help deter squash bugs, although I'll tell you, they don't completely do it. I plant my tomatoes with marigolds by them because those help deter aphids. Carrots also go very well with tomatoes. So companion planting is a completely separate subject altogether. And we do teach parts of that in our intensive gardening course that we're going to be offering, and our vegetable gardening course that we're going to be offering next month as well. So if you'd want that in a little bit more detail, I do talk about that later on. But companion planting is awesome. I encourage you to read up on it and incorporate that into your plan for your garden as you're planting out your seeds here.
Okay. The next one is, do you put the plastic lids on your containers to keep them from drying out?
Great question, and I didn't cover that, so I'm really glad that you talked about that. So I talked about how this can be a mini greenhouse, right? Okay, so let's talk about what it needs at the beginning. In the beginning, before the seeds germinate, it needs heat, the right amount of heat. Most seeds don't need light, although there are some seeds that need light to germinate. So I don't really want to put those white plastic lids back on these and keep that light out of here because I don't know when it's going to germinate. So my answer to that is, and the really easy answer is, I take a little bit of saran wrap and I put it across the top of this. But I don't want to make it airtight, because if I make it airtight, that's going to encourage mold and disease in here. I want there to be some air circulation. I don't want all of that water to just evaporate out of it. So if I leave it, and you can see here how it's open at the sides, so it does allow some air circulation, but keeps most of it in there. A better solution for this would be a horticultural fabric. Let me come around here because I did bring some of that. A burlap or horticultural fabric will work rather well. I like this horticultural fabric like this. It's almost like gauze material. It will keep in some of the moisture, but it'll allow that moisture to move around. It'll allow the air to move around. And if you get the really thin stuff, that'll work really well. I use a lot of this because I put row covers on my garden. Different conversation for a different time. That goes into more of my intensive gardening techniques. I talk about that in there. But this is an awesome fabric to be using. If you have some of this extra, put it on around there with a rubber band and you'll be set. Don't put those opaque um, white covers back onto your bins, because that won't work out well for you. It won't allow enough air circulation, and it will cause problems. It won't allow the light.
Where can you find the fabric?
So you can get them at specialty garden stores, at nurseries, or in this time of COVID, I ordered all of mine off of a prominent online retailer. And just search for horticultural fabric. You'll notice that it can give, they advertise them by their thickness. And that's out of the degree protection that they give your plants when you're creating row covers for them. You can get anywhere between about a degree to 4 degrees of protection. What you want to be getting here with this is you want to be going for more of the 1 degree, the really thin stuff that's more like gauze material, and that works out really well.
What type of soil was included in the packs from the library?
Very good question. The packs that I sent out have a potting soil. I don't remember, I think it's Pennington or something. It's in blue bags, and we just divided that out into the gallon bags. For my garden soil, potting soil, I can use that, but I also like making up my own, because once you get into this a little bit more, getting the raw materials of that peat moss, the vermiculite, and the compost, I get fantastic results with that. But if you need more of that, go ahead and get that. You don't need to worry about getting potting soil that has, fertilizers in it, because if you'll notice, a lot of the fertilizer companies, chemical companies that normally try and market their chemicals to you, now they're making potting soils and garden soils that have their fertilizers in it. Really, the best fertilizer for your garden is compost, and maybe compost is the second best fertilizer. Best fertilizer for your garden is really worm castings, probably, but compost is perfectly good, and you'll find that most gardeners who have been around for a while don't use a whole lot of chemicals on their garden. They use more compost on the garden to feed it and feed the soil that they can grow out of. I used to use a lot of the prominent chemicals that promise you miracles when you're growing, and I don't use those as much anymore, because I find they're not necessary and they're almost a waste of money.
Somebody said, I see the planting charts, but when should we start planting our seeds inside? In other words, like 4 to 6 weeks before the planting time?
Very good. So those of you who got the kits from us will see that on each one of those packets, it will tell you how long before you want to be germinating them. For example, what am I doing right now? Well, I have my dill planted, and I have tons. I've got 2 of these containers full of dill. Why do I have dill? Number one, I like making pickles, and I use dill for them. I like using them as seasoning. But I also do a lot with pollinators, and dill is a host plant for the eastern blotch swallowtail butterfly and works really well for that. So I overplant dill in my garden all the time, because I like having butterflies around. And if you like having butterflies, plant some dill or some parsley. And right now is an excellent time to do both of those, although dill will germinate, has a higher germination rate than most parsleys. What else do I have? I have my peppers that are started now. I have my herbs like thyme. I have my eggplants that are started now. Anything that is about 8 weeks, that requires about 8 weeks prior, that's what you want to be looking for at this time. And by the way, those pubs that I gave you, those charts, those give you a good, they have a chart on there that tells you the right time to be doing all sorts of planting.
Somebody said, could you, I forgot about these. So just regular lights, do you have any information about grow lights? Is there a certain color light we need, like warm, a soft glow, white?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you remember back in the day, not too long ago, before we had LED lights, we had a lot of grow lights that had a blue tint to them, right? And that was to get it as close to natural light as possible so they could grow. Most LED lights now, most of these shop lights are about a color range of about 4,000 degrees Kelvin, which is degrees Kelvin is how they measure it. An incandescent bulb is about 2,700 degrees Kelvin. Bright sunlight outside is about 6,000 degrees Kelvin, and most of these shop lights are right around the middle there. They're cutting the difference, and they're at 4,000 degrees Kelvin. That works great. The big thing that you want to be looking for is lumen count out of that. You really want that, but I mean, you can't get much cheaper than these shop lights. They really work well. So if you can have the space to do something like this, these shop lights work fantastic. I will also show you that another way to do it, well, you can do all sorts of other things, like before I got all of these shop lights, or if I need some additional lighting, I also have these old lights that you probably remember from Science Lab. And I've got some bulbs in it, and these have some old compact fluorescent bulbs in it, but I'd be putting LEDs in it now. These work great for supplemental light if I need it. And you can get little things like this off online retailers for about $4. Really, really simple to do that. They've got a little clamp on them, so you can easily clamp it on to something like someplace like this, and I can use that on my plants as well. What other questions?
Somebody pointed out that it works well if you use one of those large salad green containers with a clear lid. That
Yes.
works well.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody asked, do you test your soil?
Okay, so that's a great question. If I was digging soil up out of my garden to use that, which I do not recommend, but if I was doing that for starting my seeds, I would test the soil. The soil that is coming out of these bags, or that I put together with the organic compost and peat moss and vermiculite that I make up myself, I don't need to test that. That is already in the correct range, and I know that because I'm buying it from places that have tested it before they're selling it to me. So I don't need to do that. But if it's soil that's already been outside, which I do not recommend, then you would probably want to test that.
So somebody is asking just a clarity about the lighting and the warm mats on a timer.
Okay, so I have these set to go on at about 6:30 in the morning and go off about 8:30 at night. So I set them all up so they're all routed through the same timer, and they come on together and then they go off together. So it mimics, as you know, again, I'm trying to mimic the growing conditions that these would be exposed to, say in April. So I want to give them about the amount of light that they're going to be getting then and the amount of heat that they'd be getting then. So I give them a cooling off period at night and then ramp them up again during the day.
And somebody asked, sorry I missed this, but how long does it take to harden off the plant?
Hardening off is a process that takes anywhere between 10 days to 2 weeks. So you just want to do it gradually. 2 hours, start with 2 hours in filtered early morning sunlight and gradually build up from there. Remember, the harshest light that we have is in the afternoon, no matter where we are. So giving them the filtered sunlight in the morning, starting them off that way, and then moving them into more direct sunlight after a couple days, the next couple days, just really gradually helping them get used to it.
Asking a clarifying question for someone.
Okay.
If my soil gets moldy, should I throw out the entire container of soil, or is it okay to keep it?
Well, if plants are growing in it, then I would just get rid of the excess water in there. Make sure you have good airflow through it, and that mold will die. That mold will go away. But if you don't have anything growing in it yet, just throw that soil into your compost pile and start again with some fresh soil and fresh seeds.
Do we have to use all the seeds in the kit?
No, you don't. I gave you a variety of different seeds that are in the kit. And by the way, I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a plug right here. Those seeds that you got were thanks to the generosity of 2 seed companies, Renee's Garden, which is located out of California, and Hertz Seeds, which I think is out of the Northeast. And both of these are incredibly generous, and we would not have been able to give you the seed packets that we put together for you without their generosity, and they help us out with our programs every year. So if you're looking for people to support, they supported us for this, and I appreciate that. And they've got very good websites, especially Renee's Garden. And Hearts is quite fine too. There's lots of information that you can get off of these. I gave you a variety of seeds so you could try those out in your garden. Maybe try some things that you haven't tried. And while I'm on the topic of trying things that you haven't tried, I'm not a huge fan of completely revamping everything that you're doing and doing everything wholesale different. Take the things I've been telling you today. Pick one or two things that you think that you could incorporate into your routine. Try those out this season. See how that works for you. Build on that. Don't try and go hardcore a completely different way. Otherwise, it might be a little bit harder for you. But try a couple new. Every year I try a new varietal of a crop that I've never tried before, just to see what it's like. So I keep exposing myself to new things, and that's the same way with these techniques. What other questions?
Okay, so somebody's saying, so can I have success if I don't have a heat mat, if I don't have the light? Are there things that they can grow successfully without that light?
So without a heat mat, yes, you can be successful. Look at the temperature charts that I showed you earlier. I would recommend trying some spinaches and lettuces. Those don't require it under some heat mats. And you could try tomatoes and peppers. Your success rate just won't be quite as good as it otherwise would be. You're raising by having the heat mats, that raises your success rate and helps you out. And these things last for years. Without the lights, it is hard to be successful without the right amount of light. So lights are not a huge investment. There's all sorts of different lights that are smaller than this setup here, that you don't have to go with as big of a setup as I have. And realistically, this doesn't take up that much room, which is why I built it. So the whole thing was for me to not take up as much room. But if this is too much for you, get an LED light that you can use that can be dedicated to your plants. That's the real thing, that it's hard to be successful without the right amount of light.
Somebody was asking, do you have to create one of these fancy
No,
cards?
No, you don't.
What I did, I hope everybody can hear me. What I did was, we have one of those metal wire shelving units.
Yeah.
And we just hooked the same lights onto it, and I use books to actually elevate the boxes.
So she brings these up to the lights rather than bringing the lights down.
Absolutely. So sometimes we can hang them with the chain, but most of the time I just use books to push it up, and then I can just lower it as they grow. And that has been so much easier.
Yeah, so you're going to figure out what works for you. Remember, I showed you some pictures earlier. I started doing this on bookshelves and just taking over a couple of shelves in the house. And you're not going to be germinating necessarily for your garden 200 plants on your own. So you don't need this much room the first time. Now, you might find out that you really like this and you want to go into it a little bit more the following year. But for this year, just take one of these containers, plant it up, and put it on a bookshelf and put a light over it. Maybe get a heating pad if you want. I hope that answered the question.
Somebody's asking, do seeds expire?
Yes, seeds do expire. So the best way to store your seeds from previous years is to store them in a cool, dry place. Lots of people who do that store them in the back of a refrigerator. Maybe if you have a fridge out in the garage, putting them in a crisper drawer out there and storing them that way. That's an excellent way to store them. But if I have a bunch of seeds that are old and haven't germinated very well, or might not have a good germination rate, here's my tip to doing that. I take a container of vermiculite, just like this. And this container is nothing more than a takeout container from a Chinese restaurant. Makes it really simple. And I spread a thin layer of vermiculite in here. Then I spread my seeds in here as well, sprinkle them in here. Then I put then I wet it down, and I will either put the lid loosely on it, like this. I just won't put it on very tightly, again, to just kind of keep some of the moisture content up in there. And I'll put it on a heating mat. And then as those seedlings start germinating in there, they're going to throw out their first 2 leaves, the cotyledons, and they're going to start growing from there. Then I know that it's ready to go. So I'll take my trusty chopstick and I will gently dig under that, just kind of like I'm scooping it out. So I scoop out the seeds, and then I will gently transplant that into a newspaper pot. And that's how I germinate seeds when I'm not sure how well they're going to all be germinating. So some of my native plants, and I'm not sure, my blackberry lilies. This is an easy way to germinate blackberry lilies, and it goes like, once they start germinating, I just transfer them into the newspaper pot.
Somebody's asking, how close to the top do you put the soil in the little?
Into here, I fill it up pretty close to the top. You can see how much I did this one, and the reason for that is, once I wet this down, it's going to compact down a little bit. It's the most airy that it's ever going to be right now. So I want it to be kind of up close to the top. So once it compacts down, there'll be enough soil in there for that plant to grow for the next 2 months on.
Oh, somebody just pointed out if you get a 1.5 PVC, that should work to wrap.
Yes.
And then you can just kind of fold it in at the bottom.
Yep, that's a great technique. Whether you use 1.5 PVC, whether you use these spice bottles, or whether you break down and do one of these. I had someone who came to one of these talks and saw this, and he's a wood turner, and next thing I knew, he had turned one of these for himself. But that's more of a specialty skill.
What do you do to the old soil?
Okay. So this goes into more about what I talk about in my intensive gardening techniques. I don't use the soil that's out there in my yard. Why don't I do that? Well, because it's got weed seeds in it. It's got all sorts of other seeds. I don't know the chemical composition of that soil. It might be too sandy or too clay, not the right amount of loaminess that I need in that soil. So when I build my raised beds, I build my own soil for those raised beds. And that might sound like a lot of work, but it's like the foundation for your house. If you spend the time to put the right foundation down on your house, it's going to go a lot better. If you don't spend the time on that, you're always going to be correcting for those problems. So when I put the soil in my bed, I put down some shade cloth at the bottom, some permeable fabric, or you can also use cardboard or layers of newspaper. And then I put a mixture of equal parts of vermiculite, peat moss, and compost in there. And then I turn that up, and that will give me the right medium for that I need to be successful in growing in there. And then every year, as I deplete the resources in there, I use that same soil that was in there the year before, and I top dress the whole thing with a layer of compost. And that gives me the nutrients back into the soil that I was taking out the previous year by the crops that I had and I was growing in there.
How about squirrels?
Okay.
How can we get, somebody specifically said, how can you get the squirrels not to eat your tomatoes? Good luck.
Good luck with that. My squirrels come in and go to my favorite tomatoes. I love sweet Chelsea tomatoes. They're a great varietal that grows really well around here. Nice big cherry tomato with great taste and just the right amount of meatiness. So that's a varietal I especially like around here. They will go into my garden and they will take a somewhat green that's just starting to turn ripe tomato. They'll take it off, they'll take a bite out of it, and they'll leave it on the fence I have around my garden just to taunt me. Squirrels, gray squirrels, that is, not the flying squirrels. I love flying squirrels, but gray squirrels are the bane of most gardeners' existence. So there's a couple of ways that you can deal with that. One way that you can deal with that is you can build a structure that you're growing things in that is covered with a netting material that won't allow birds or squirrels into it, or with chicken wire. I know some people who have built an entire enclosure for their garden that is chicken wire, and there's a door to go in, and they do things that way. That's a lot more involved than I've gotten with my garden, but some people do that, and it works out well for them. Short of that, there's not a whole lot of other things.
I will say at the vegetable gardening class, they will be talking about that.
Yes, they will.
Some.
Yes. You can also get a cat that patrols your garden, or a dog that's outside that likes chasing squirrels. And those are potential deterrents, but it's hard to solve the problem.
Somebody just said, so we should strip everything out of our garden now, and I'm saying,
Yeah, don't. It depends on how you're going to do it, and so this is really more about seed starting, and not so much into all of the details with the how you garden either in rows or in raised beds. That we have time to do that. You don't need to be starting on that right now. There is still time. The reason why we're scheduling these when we do is because now is the time that you want to start your seeds indoors for certain things like peppers and eggplants. Not necessarily this early for tomatoes, like I talked about, or necessarily some kinds of marigolds, but for some things. And so if I give you this information now and you start on this, then I can come back in March and tell you the next thing that you need to be doing, which is maybe constructing your raised beds or thinking about your soil in there. But the short answer that doesn't have all the nuances that I would try and answer this with is fresh soil that hasn't been in the ground for your garden for raised beds is really the best way to be going about it. What other questions?
for this area right now, it's a good time to start seeds. What? Just in general?
Well, it depends, like I said before, it depends on the type of seed. If you were to start seeds for tomatoes right now, those are going to be ready in about 4 weeks, and the ground is not going to be ready for them to go in. Your tomatoes really want, in order to be doing well, really want soil temperatures of 50 degrees before you put them into the ground. So if you were to go out in March and put those into the ground, when those tomatoes would be ready to go in, you're not going to have good results. So that's why I talked about those publications. That's why I included those publications in the kits that I sent out, and why I talked so much about the Virginia Tech website that has all of that. And that, just in case you didn't see it, is pubs.ext.bt.edu. And I will put that up again at the end of this if you didn't get the kits and need the QR codes for the different publications that I specifically recommend.
One person says, is it possible to grow vegetables to full maturity solely indoors?
Yes, yes, it is. Good luck with that. It takes a lot more skill to do that, but it is possible. That's more of an advanced gardening technique, or hydroponics really does that a lot. There is a lot to learn about hydroponics. It takes different skills in this, and like a lot of things, once you get your system down and you understand the system, you can repeat that and achieve a lot of success. But it's getting the system down to begin with and solving your issues with that is a steep learning curve. Once you get that, you'll be great. There are stores in the local area that specialize in hydroponics that are quite good at it, and I'd encourage you to visit them. That's one of the best ways to do that. And also look at the Virginia Tech website. We do have publications for that.
I just said full to maturity, inside baby lettuce, kale, spinach, cilantro, basil. Those things are real easy.
Yeah, super easy. Cilantro is one thing. I was talking to Susan about this before we got started. Cilantro is a thing that I always tried in using these techniques, and I was never very good with that. That cilantro, if you're not familiar with the herb, with growing it, It is more of a cool season herb. So you would start it when it's cool outside. By the time it gets into the heat of the summer, it's going to be dying off. And I was never very successful with that. So one of the things that I do, and this is a little bit more than I normally talk about in here, if I get a container like a strawberry container or a spinach container or something along those lines, one of these clear plastic containers, and it's about 4 inches taller. So you don't want the very shallow ones. You want them deeper. And I make sure that it has holes both at the bottom and at the top. And if it doesn't have enough, I'll take my drill and put a couple holes in it. And then what I'll do, and this works awesome for cilantro or for native plants if you're germinating those seeds. If the holes are a little bit too big at the bottom, I put one thin layer of paper towels at the bottom of it, but just very thin. And then I'll put about 1 inch of potting soil at the bottom. Not a whole lot, but about 1 inch. And then I will sprinkle the seeds on top of that. Then if they're like cilantro, which you could use a little bit of soil over it, I'll put a thin layer of soil over it. Or if they're surface germinating seeds, I won't even do that. Then I'll wet the whole thing down, get nice and wet. I'll label it so I don't forget what's in here. Then I'll close it up like this. Again, this is nice and heavy now. It's wet. It's fully wet, but it can drain out the bottom. Then I'm going to put this outside in my garden, someplace in my garden where it's going to be exposed to all the elements. It's going to get sun. It's going to get rain. It's going to get snow. It's going to freeze out there. Okay, and in a couple of weeks, as the season goes on, as I get closer into April, I'm going to notice that I'm going to have a whole bunch of seedlings germinating in here, doing really well. And then all I have to do is pop it back open, take my my very expensive chopstick tool that I have right here, and again, dig under them to make sure I'm getting the weeds out, the roots out, and not disturbing those roots too much. Pull that out, and then pot it up from there, or plant it into the garden from there. And I'm going to be great, and I'll have tons of seedlings. But the nice thing is, since I'm using fresh soil, fresh potting mix that I know didn't have anything in it beforehand, I know that everything that's germinating in here is what I planted in here and not any weeds or anything else. So it's a super easy way of germinating things using a slightly different technique. It's a little bit more advanced, but it's not too advanced, and anyone in here could easily do that. And this works really well for cilantro.
Maybe thinking of the seeds that were in the seed starter kit, one person is saying, what should we start right now?
Right, so no one got exactly the same seeds in their seed starting kit as the next person, but the peppers, the eggplant, the parsley, those are all good ones to start right now and get those going. And look on each one of those packets. It will tell you how long before you need before planting them outside. It'll tell you start 6 to 8 weeks prior. Well, that's the peppers, that's the eggplants, that's the parsley. Start those now. And so there are those QR codes and those links if you need them. So you can go ahead and see those publications that I would recommend. A lot of those publications will answer a lot of the same questions that many of you were asking here today. So those are good resources for you if you want to remember it. Also remember that you can always communicate with me and ask questions, and I'm happy to answer them. I'm fairly active in the York Coast Master Gardeners Facebook group, so you can find me there. And the other thing is, if you are looking for specific seeds, we still have some seeds available if you're looking for a specific kind. So if you can't find it, let us know, and we'll see what we can do to help you out.